I don't know about you, but like many folks I talk to, we're often frustrated about the process of drawing legislative boundaries. Does that frustrate anybody? Over the years, we've become very adept at drawing up homogeneous political boundaries where politicians pick their districts rather than districts picking their legislators. That's not to poke fun at either party, since both have been guilty. But there's a group of North Carolinians supporting a model that removes line drawing power from the legislature and rests that power with an independent body. They believe that the redistricting process needs to be open and transparent. The process must include significant public input with the opportunity for citizens to weigh in on proposed legislative maps. To speak to this important good governance issue, we have two well-known political commentators from two very different political perspectives with us this afternoon. Chris Fitzsimon is the founder and director of North Carolina Policy Watch, a progressive public policy think tank that is a special project of the North Carolina Justice Center. Fitzsimon writes the daily Fitzsimon File, delivers a daily radio commentary that is broadcast statewide on the North Carolina News Network, and hosts News and Views, a weekly radio news magazine that airs on the network stations. And John Hood is president and chairman of the John Locke Foundation, a North Carolina think tank that issues policy studies, hosts dozens of events and training sessions each year, produces broadcast programs, and publishes the Carolina Journal, a newspaper, website, and radio program with a monthly audience of nearly 200,000 North Carolinians. John helped found the John Locke Foundation in 1989. Please welcome Chris and John to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for having us. Is this on? I guess it is. John and I are here to talk about legislative redistricting. There's a lot obviously going on in Raleigh that I think is impacted by the way our districts are drawn. So what we thought we'd do is just each talk maybe for 3 or 4 minutes about why we care about this and why it has me saying the unusual sentence of John Hood is right, which I think I say once about every 5 years, but it's always about this issue. Right now, I know there are a lot of candidates here and some legislators and other public officials here. But in November, when people go to the polls in North Carolina, more than half the people of North Carolina, the decision for who's going to represent them in the General Assembly has already been made. There are 70, I believe, roughly, there we go, 70 districts in North Carolina where there is no opponent. The Democrat doesn't have an opponent, the Republican doesn't have an opponent on the ballot. When you add in another 15% or so, that's roughly 60% of the General Assembly, 58%. If you add in another 10 or 15% where there is only token opposition, where the district is so one-sided, we're really talking about maybe 10 to 15% of the districts in the North Carolina General Assembly where people's votes matter. And think about that, what that says about democracy. If you look at the approval ratings of the current General Assembly, there's a poll done at the end of July. It's in the low 30s to high 20s, depending on which poll you use. The Republicans have a high disapproval rating. The Democrats have a less, but still not great approval rating. People are upset and angry about the way the political system works, and I think a large part of that is that they think their vote doesn't matter. And unfortunately, in General Assembly races in North Carolina, too often their vote really doesn't matter. Another way to think about this is Barack Obama won North Carolina in 2008 in a very close election. Mitt Romney won North Carolina in 2012 by a slightly larger margin, but still a very close election. North Carolina, the Senate race between Kay Hagan and Tom Tillis, by all polls, is maybe Hagan's ahead a few percentage points in one poll. Maybe she's behind by 1 or 2. So in effect, that race looks like it's a dead heat as we sit here in the middle of August. North Carolina is an evenly divided state, and yet we have a General Assembly that has a supermajority of Republicans in the House and the Senate. We have a congressional delegation that has 9 Republicans and 4 Democrats, and conceivably could have 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats if things break a certain way in November. So we have an evenly divided state, and yet one party has a supermajority. This is not, as you heard in the introduction, this is not an indictment of the Republicans drawing the maps. The Democrats drew the maps for years before that and did much the same thing. Republicans, thanks to technology, had much better computers and drew them even better. I was actually in House Speaker Dan Blue's office in 1991 when we drew the legislative districts, and that was the first time computers had been used. And I was amazed at that time how specific they could be. And little did I know how specific they would be in 2011, where you're literally going through a neighborhood if you wanted to, and often did, and pick out a few houses on one side of the street and then jump across the road and pick out a few other houses to make sure that the person in your the district you wanted to draw was going to be heavily Republican or heavily Democrat. So well, we're here not just representing our own organizations, but with the North Carolina Coalition for Lobbying and Government Reform. We've been working on this issue for a long time, as long as I've been involved in the public policy world. And it used to be one of the few things the Republicans in the General Assembly agreed with me on was we have to fix the way we do legislative redistricting. And Senator Ham Horton of Winston-Salem, the late Senator Horton, who I had a ton of respect for, and Senator Ellie Kinnaird, who recently retired, every year introduced a bill for independent redistricting, and the Democratic majority at the time wasn't interested in bringing it up. But all the Republicans were my friends at that time on that issue. And all the members of the current Republican legislative leadership signed the bills in the last few years before they were in the majority calling for this commission. Then, after the Republicans took power, some of them forgot the bills they had signed, apparently. And the Democrats, who used to be adamantly opposed to this idea, were encouraging me to write about it some more and keep talking about it so we could change these districts around. So clearly we have a problem when, as you heard also in the introduction, the best line to describe this is when we have politicians picking their voters instead of the other way around. I think it's a big factor, and what we'd like to see is the Raleigh Chamber and you as individual business people get on board an effort, a bipartisan effort, a bi-philosophical effort, if there is such a word, to try to change the way we do redistricting in North Carolina for congressional legislative districts. There are plenty of models out there. One passed the House in 2011 based on the Iowa model, where a plan is developed by an expert staff person in essence, and that plan is presented to the General Assembly and voted up or down. They can't change it, they can't monkey with it. If they defeat it, they'll get another plan from an expert, but they can't change one to help their friends, and they can't move the districts around. And I'll close my remarks with one. When I mentioned I was in Dan Blue's office, and the one time I learned about the adage that all politics is local, never did I realize how true that was when we were doing redistricting. I had Republicans who were so opposed to Dan Blue's agenda at the time, and who maybe his fiercest enemies would come by the office at the end of the day and sit in my office or sit in another staff person's office and just say, if there's one small favor we could do them, could we move these 3 precincts from the town, their hometown that weren't supportive, could we move them into somebody else's district? And that was going, and even if it would hurt a fellow Republican, it was all about self-preservation. And I think we need voters to decide if politicians are preserved, not politicians. So with that, I'll let John have at it.
As you should. It's important to think about this issue as deeply connected to North Carolina's history. As has been said, this is not a phenomenon that has suddenly presented itself and we should be outraged. This is a very common practice in North Carolina and most other states through much of our modern political, in fact, not so modern political history. You can see it in the map of North Carolina itself. Before the advent of the civil rights legislation and other requirements that prevented the most extreme kinds of gerrymandering, states had a wide amount of discretion about how to draw particularly legislative districts. And there was no requirement that you have roughly equal numbers of people in each district. In fact, the practice for a long time was that counties were represented in the General Assembly. So the more counties you had, the more members you had. And indeed, if you look at North Carolina's map right now, you will see the vestigial remainder of that, because look at the northeast quadrant of the state, and you will see a very large number of very small counties. Perquimans and Pasquotank and Camden, Hertford. Now, why does the map look like that? Because way back when the eastern elites were in control of the legislature, they wanted to maintain control, so they made sure there were lots of counties in the east, each getting a representative or 2, but not very many counties in the west. And you would see Rowan, what was then Rowan County, was gigantic. At one point, Rowan County was almost 1/4 of the whole state. Now that is extreme gerrymandering. You can't get away with that quite as much, but you can still get away with a lot. So I was looking recently at the last several decades of districts and electoral outcomes. And one reasonable way to think about this, and we all sort of now know in the aftermath of Bush v. Gore, that the popular vote can be different from what actually happens at the end of the day because of the rules of the electoral game. So if we compare the statewide vote for Democratic candidates for the legislature to statewide vote for Republican candidates to the legislature, that's a kind of a rough popular vote. It's not quite right, but it's fairly close. So what is the gap between the number of votes that each party gets and the number of seats that they get? That's a kind of a way of indicating the extent of the skew of the maps one way or the other. Well, in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, routinely that skew would be somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 points for the Democrats, who were the majority party, of course, at the time in drawing the maps. So, for example, Republicans might get 45, well, not that much. They might get 35% of the vote, but they wouldn't even get 25% of the seats. This was a fairly common kind of outcome during this period. In the 90s, it got a little bit better, actually. The computers came on board and you could play more games, but there were actually legal constraints that started to be placed on gerrymandering that somewhat made the situation better. And in particular, after 2000, when the reapportionment occurred and then the redistricting occurred, there was litigation insisting that North Carolina's state constitutional requirement to respect county lines was still a real requirement and had not been nuked by the passage of the Voting Rights Act. That litigation succeeded in the state courts, which led to maps that were the least gerrymandered that we had seen, in an area where you might actually see only a 4 to 6 point difference between the number of votes that a party gets and the number of seats, the percentage of the total number of seats that the party would receive. However, even during that period, we still had some perverse results. In 2000, 2002, and 2004, in each of those election cycles, either one or both chambers was controlled by the party that got the fewer number of votes. Okay? That actually isn't even that bad today. The Republican majorities are exaggerated by the maps that they drew, but at least they got a majority of the votes in 2012. But there were periods in 2000, 2002, 2004, where then the Democrats actually got fewer votes statewide, but controlled the chamber, sometimes by several seats. So that tells us that redistricting matters. Now, neither Chris nor I is saying that redistricting is the entire story. It's not the unified field theory like physics that explains everything in politics. I mean, it couldn't be, because the Democrats drew the maps, but Republicans occasionally won. So we know that it can't be an entirely controlled process. We know that in 2010, the Republicans, even though they were running in Democratic drawn maps, did win fairly convincing majorities in the legislature. But notice that that was at the end of the decade. The beginning of the decade, you're working with your just off the presses census data, and they're fairly good. And they tell you where people live, and you can kind of jury-rig the maps accordingly. Well, it turns out that people are ornery, they move around, and they don't do exactly what you want, and population growth continues. And so by the time you get to the end of the decade, redistricting's not quite, or gerrymander is not quite as effective as it would have been at the beginning of the decade. You see what I mean? You've sort of slipped away from your initial body of knowledge. And so districts that might once have been uncompetitive start to range into the category of competitive. And even a few districts that might have originally started out as competitive sort of start tilting one way or the other. So in 2010, the Republicans sort of went against the grain and won anyway, but that's not shocking because it was towards the end of the cycle. Now, why do I bring that up? Because all the way until 2010, Democrats who were certainly in theory capable of agreeing with us on redistricting reform, would in practice think, I don't need to do this, we're going to be in charge. In fact, the Democrats used to say, quite explicitly, We should be in charge. It is important that we be in charge because otherwise education will suffer and economic development will suffer. So it is possible to rationalize what looks like a self-serving kind of a thing, like let's gerrymander the maps, but to rationalize it to actually be in the public interest. Republicans probably feel that way now. It's good that Republicans are in charge because otherwise all these bad things would happen. So both sides are capable of rationalizing self-interested behavior. If all we were doing was writing columns, which are brilliant, by the way, but if all we were doing was making these sorts of good government arguments, we might be pessimistic that lawmakers who are self-interested and who have an interest, not just a self-interest, but actually a public, they believe themselves to be the right people in the right jobs and they want to stay in those jobs. It might be difficult to imagine how we would ever prevail. But there is a self-interest argument for redistricting reform too. And in 2010, in March of 2010, Democrats that I would have talked to wouldn't have bought it. But I bet you in December of 2010, they would have really wish I had passed redistricting reform. Because you never really know who's going to draw the maps. The Democrats assumed, because they had always drawn the maps, that they would continue to draw the maps. But it didn't happen that way because of that Republican breakout in 2010. Well, Republicans had no reason to think any differently, though I suspect they probably do, but there's no good reason. We don't know who's going to win the control of the General Assembly in 2020. We really have no idea. The maps do not guarantee the Republicans will win. As I said, if that was true, then how did the Republicans win in 2010 under Democratic maps? You can't guarantee it. You never know what's going to happen. 2020 happens to be a presidential year. That actually makes it harder to predict. Republicans, in at least the last couple of decades, tend to do a little bit better. There are counter examples like 2006. But generally, Republicans tend to do a little bit better in midterm elections. That's because Republican-leaning voters tend to be more likely to turn out. So in a midterm election where the turnout's a little bit lower than it would be in a presidential year, Republicans, we might imagine, enjoy at least a small edge. But you see, 2020 is not one of those years. 2020 is a presidential year. And it might be an open gubernatorial seat, or it might be Roy Cooper running for re-election. We don't know. It might be a Democratic incumbent president. It might be Hillary Clinton running for re-election. Or it might be Mitt Romney running for re-election. I don't know. But the point is, we don't know. And neither do the legislators. And the argument might very well be, it is in your own self-interest, member of the legislature, regardless of party, to take out an insurance policy against a catastrophic loss. You hope you never have to make the claim, but man, you are happy if the situation develops and you need to make the claim. So in this case, Republicans might be persuaded to think about the 2021 redistricting cycle and imagining that they'd be in power, but hey, what if we're not? We'll take out an insurance policy to hedge our downside risk. And that would be, in this case, some kind of redistricting reform that limits the discretion of whoever is deciding the maps. Now, there are many different models that we can use. As Chris has already alluded to, we could use a redistricting commission model, which was what Ham Horton and Ellie Kinnaird used to argue for. Or we could do the Iowa staff-driven model that's actually passed the House. Or maybe somebody else has it even, maybe one of you has an even better idea. I can't suggest this, but you might recommend that I be given unilateral authority.
That'd be a good idea.
I could be trusted. But my point is, whatever the process that we choose, the most important part of that is actually not even the identity of the people drawing the maps, it's limiting the degrees of freedom that anybody has to draw maps. So they can't just go in and do this. They have to respect, for example, county lines, or they have to respect perhaps municipal lines, or they have to maximize compactness, which you can measure arithmetically. You can measure that. So there's different kinds of standards you can put into place, and if you combine that with a commission or a staff-driven model or something like that, and you can even preserve, for the purposes of constitutionality, the legislature voting up or down, but not amending, but voting up or down. Any of those arrangements, I think we would be open to, as long as the outcome is the maps look a little more rational. Notice I didn't say perfect or really rational, but a little more rational. And that means, therefore, there's more competitive races. More competition is good. More competition also means more risk. You might have bigger swings, but in a closely divided state, I can see control of the legislature bouncing back and forth every, couple of cycles or 3 or 4 cycles, and I don't see that as, from the standpoint of the republic, I don't see that as a real downside. So we are cautiously optimistic that there's an opportunity to make this case to the legislature starting next year. By the way, we don't know what the legislature is going to look like even next year. Right, Tom? We don't know. We're not sure. It's probably going to remain in Republican hands, again, given a certain number of factors, but we don't know. But the point is, whatever happens this fall, no one can accurately predict what will happen in the fall of 2020. In fact, if you can, come see me afterwards. We'll start a company. We will keep all of our information very quiet. We will make gobs of money. But because no one can know that, we need to be thinking about a process that serves the public interest and a process that can actually be sold to politicians as serving their own interest too. That's the argument we have, and since I can't imagine you disagreeing with us, I'm not sure what we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about. But you might, or you might give us additional guidance as to what you'd like us to address on this subject. So we'll open it up. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. So geography seems to be the driver both in what's required and what we're aiming to sort of preserve. But one of the reasons for gerrymandering, or whatever term you want to use for it, is to help ensure that certain types of population aren't excluded from service.
Right.
Race is a good example of that in our own case. How would you take that factor into consideration while at the same time focusing on geography and compactness?
That's the most important issue that we didn't address yet. So thank you for asking that question, which we planted. The Voting Rights Act and its implications for North Carolina is the major complicating factor here. It's what makes North Carolina different from, say, Iowa, where they had the Iowa system. And if you look at the districts in Iowa, I mean, they are almost box-like. I mean, it's very easy to follow, and it's very competitive in Iowa.
Shape, too.
Yeah, it follows. It goes to show. But I mean, Iowa is a very competitive state for congressional races and for legislative races. And that is largely because of the system they have. But what I would say is there is an important distinction, which is that Iowa is not under the jurisdiction. Now, technically, North Carolina is not under the jurisdiction of parts of the Voting Rights Act, but there are quite a few counties, jurisdictions that are. So effectively, we are. And what that means is that how the Voting Rights Act is defined and enforced in court makes a big difference in what happens with our maps and how redistricting reform would function. If North Carolina changes our system to have a commission or have a staff-driven Iowa type system or whatever it is, compliance with the Voting Rights Act will be one of the rules of the game that will have to be respected by this new system. And that does mean, that's why I was saying earlier, what we imagine is not a perfectly rational outcome, like geographically, where it all looks like boxes or all the communities are like. That's actually not going to be possible given VRA requirements. There are going to be some districts that we might aesthetically see as sort of odd-looking or squiggly, but they're designed to comply with the Voting Rights Act, and those are going to be constraints on the system. Effectively, what happened was in the 1980s, maybe the 70s, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, there was a kind of a de facto political alliance between African American leaders on the one hand and Republicans on the other. They saw themselves as having a common interest in redrawing the maps for Congress and for the legislature so there would be more districts where African Americans would be likely to be elected, and correspondingly that would create more districts where Republicans would be more likely to be elected. This was a conscious strategy in lots of states, not just North Carolina. And if you think about it, it did happen that way. There were African American leaning districts created for Congress in North Carolina, and those did elect Mel Watt and Eva Clayton, Butterfield, some others, or about to be others. But at the same time, Republicans actually gained in the congressional delegation, and those were not unrelated events. And in the legislature, this was even more obviously true. To say that it is a factor that's going to influence the outcome and make it maybe not look quite like Iowa is not to argue against redistricting reform. It's to actually think about setting our expectations in a realistic way.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than it is a factor, and it's certainly possible to do that in a voting rights state. We have, I think, 40 counties in North Carolina covered by the voting rights in the east primarily, I guess all of them, even northeast. But what has happened now is that some of the map drawers have sort of hidden behind the intent of the Voting Rights Act and not only created majority minority districts, but created minority districts with 80 or 90% minority voters because they wanted to pack them all in the district so they'd create more Republican districts, which is exactly the sort of shenanigans that we don't want to happen to make these districts, other districts, so one-sided one way or the other. So I think it's just another, it's not even a hurdle, it's just another factor to consider, and I don't think that would actually be an issue that would make this all that difficult. We certainly could do it.
I disagree a little bit with that.
I thought you might.
Well, because what the actual dispute was about is to whether you have to draw majority-minority districts per se. In other words, the argument became it would be enough to have districts with 39% or 43% African-American vote because that still makes it likely that if they voted as a bloc, they could elect the candidate of their choice. And the Republicans responded, no, if you're going to have VRA types of rules at all, it has to be a majority rule. And so some of these districts, instead of having 43%, would have 51%.
And some would have way more than 50%.
Yeah, they do, but I'm just saying.
Right.
That's what the legal dispute was about,
Right.
is does it have to be a majority or it could be a substantial minority?
But I was saying they were making political decisions and also referring to the legal
Naturally.
dispute. Yeah.
Gary.
Gary Hill. You know, our Phil Kirk, my friend of 44 years, Phil, raise your hand, please.
This is a setup of some kind.
All right. Well, he wrote a letter to the editor recently, and I guess it was tongue-in-cheek, but you'll have to ask him. But his solution was that the Democrats for the last 127 years, and when the Republicans had it for 127 years, then we would change. Can I have equal time? I think it was 148 years. No, I made the statement, which is factual, but I don't want anybody adding the years. 44 years ago, I introduced the bill when I was in the state senate. 44 years ago, I introduced the bill to do this. Not only would the Democrats not allow it to be voted on, they wouldn't even allow it to be heard or considered in committee. And y'all done a great job pointing out it's not a one-party thing, and I subscribe to that. But, and I've been for the independent commission ever since then. It's only in the last year or two that I've changed my mind.
Are you announcing your candidacy here?
Thank you, Gary.
That was heartfelt. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. We talk a lot about with the redistricting with Republicans and Democrats, but when you look at especially the state legislature right now, it's a majority representation by rural representatives, but clearly the majority of the residents in the state of North Carolina live in municipalities of some form or other. Is that something you'll be taking into consideration in redistricting?
Majority of North Carolinians now live in metropolitan areas, yes. Not sure whether you would categorize them as urban or city dwellers or people who live in suburbs that are near cities or wherever, but yes. Now, rural lawmakers used to be a much bigger chunk of the legislature than they are now. I mean, actually, if you were having this conversation and you were the Elizabeth City Chamber of Commerce, they would be rueing the fact that they've lost all their power in Raleigh. Because urban and suburban lawmakers now make up a majority of the legislature, because you do have to follow the population trends. But the adjustment to that is basically automatic. Even if we never reform redistricting, because of reapportionment, because you have to adjust the maps to the census numbers, and because the legislative districts are roughly, I think it's plus or minus 5%, and the congressional districts are plus or minus one, they're as close as possible to one person, one vote. whatever you did, as the population continues to go into the Wake counties and Mecklenburg counties and Johnston counties and Union counties, that's where the legislative delegations are going to increasingly be, and the districts in the rural areas are going to get bigger and bigger. And by the way, as they get bigger, they actually become less gerrymandered. It's really within Wake County and within Mecklenburg County and a couple other big counties where you can see the most egregious ones.
Right, and I think that some of the districts, you know, they may take in a part of
Right.
the city, but the way the district is drawn, the majority of the district is in a more rural part of the
Yeah,
county.
absolutely.
That representative, even though they are, you know, covering a city, they're really more rural.
The Constitution requires, as much as
County lines.
possible, respecting county lines. It doesn't say anything about other kinds of boundaries. And as I said, that might be one of the things, one of the rules you add into the system would be, and you have to rank all these goals, but one of the goals would be respecting the boundaries of other jurisdictions like school systems or
I
municipalities.
do think it's worth mentioning that regardless of whether, and I hope that the General Assembly passes this in 2015 and it goes into effect with the 2020 census, that regardless, we're going to see increasing urban representation in the General Assembly no matter what happens. It doesn't mean they're going to be in appropriately drawn districts, but I think we're going to continue to see that. And I think it's probably more likely we're going to continue to see urban legislators be in the leadership positions in the General Assembly because of that fact, which is a huge change from just 20 years ago.
Bonner.
You mentioned that this could be solved by looking at density and maximizing density for arithmetically. Are there, you can imagine a scenario where you could look back over the history of the state, run a computer model at every year and look at what the implications of that would have been on the electoral process. Is there any movement towards working towards establishing that computer model, working out, looking backwards, what that would have meant over time to try and come to an agreement of what could be done moving forward?
It's an interesting idea. There isn't just one formula for doing a compactness requirement. There are several different things that I've seen anyway. You could run that model over time. Given that we need to persuade the people who are currently in office that it's a good idea, I would prioritize my work along the lines of what is the argument that is most likely to resonate with the people who will make this decision. I'm not sure that running models going back to the 1950s or whatever would be as important as, for example, arguing that you don't really know if you're going to be in power or not in 2 more cycles, and maybe you ought to hedge your bets. I think might be our stronger argument.
And my only point being that if you get past some of the historical challenges that folks, looking back, if the pendulum had swung more often based on those models, then that coupled with the argument of it's going to change, so that the pendulum doesn't take 148 years to
Yeah.
change, it swings more quickly.
It is, I mean, obviously the other analysis is the demographic shifts in North Carolina with the growth and where people are moving and what the demographic characteristics of the people who are moving to North Carolina and how that changes. That's also obviously a fascinating prospect that I think is underway to try to figure out how those demographics will look and give legislators that information. Here's what your district, you know, you can't be exact, but here's a good guess of what your district's going to look like in 6 years. And I think that will be a persuasive piece of information.
And we have been looking
Right,
exactly
trying to
at
do
those
that.
kinds of models.
You mentioned Iowa. Are there other states that have done this, and is it, you got any experience from that would be part of the story?
There are some states, now, as far as I know, there isn't any modern state that has done it the way we're asking, which is through legislative action that leads to a statute or to a constitutional amendment. These are all states that use the initiative process to do it, which is an important distinction. But I think Florida has recently done something like this. California would be another example, and I think Arizona, isn't that another one? Now, here's the challenge, though, is that in the cases at least of Arizona and California, there were commissions created, and arguably some Republicans believe they were sort of snookered on these because the way the commissions actually operated was sort of captured by what Republicans would describe as Democratic-leaning folks or groups that claimed they weren't. Now, I don't think, again, this is an argument against reform. It's an argument for getting the details right and thinking through very carefully what the most likely outcomes are. it strengthens in my mind the importance of specifying rules. Less important than the identity of the rule of the line drawers would be the rules that they have to live by. And if you can constrain discretion as much as possible, you can't quite make it a computer program because of like the Voting Rights Act, for example. But as much as you can make it like a computer program, better, because otherwise any process that looks nonpartisan could be captured by a partisan actor.
It's also an interesting thing about Iowa did it with initiative. We don't have initiative and referendum in North Carolina. I think that's a good thing. John probably thinks that's a bad thing. But we can't approve constitutional amendments. So one question is, do we do this by statute, and will the next General Assembly, with all good intentions, get into office and say, oh, I don't know, I sort of like our majority, I think I want to draw the lines, or do we need to amend the Constitution and take this to the voters and make it much more difficult, impossible really, for a General Assembly to do anything about that unless they repeal a constitutional amendment? So that's another part of the whole process that we have to think through.
It's worth also going into this, if North Carolina was to do this, we need to have our eyes open about its implications. We have talked about how it would be better to have more competitive elections and have the voters choose their governors and so forth. Keep in mind, one outcome here, if that's true, is that legislative races would become more frequent, there would be more competitive elections, and they would cost more money. So this would increase the cost of politics in North Carolina. I don't actually care about that, but some of you may. Some of you may think that's bad. In my view, the more money you spend in Rays, the more communication is going on. So it doesn't concern me. But if that is your concern, if you think elections are already too expensive, this will not make them cheaper. Because what it will do is increase the number of, it will basically expand the playing field, which means there will be more races that will be competitive where you'd want to spend money, and the two parties will be more, you see that there would no longer be jerry-rigged one way or the other, which means more money would be raised by both parties to try to maintain. So it will increase spending.
One of the most interesting criteria that you have to use, which a lot of politicians don't like, is that you can't take into account where a politician lives. So the first time you draw these districts, you don't even know. Ideally, you would draw districts without knowing where any incumbent lives when you start. So you might have a case where there could be 3 incumbents, in one Senate district, which would, of course, just be too bad. But I think that's would be interesting.
John.
A proposal for the Iowa model passed the North Carolina House in 2011, and we were happy to see that. The Senate chose not to take it up. It did not pass a chamber in the 2013-2014 session, which of course is still going on. I don't know. They might be calling an emergency rules committee in the middle of the night and pass it. But so it's the closest we've ever come. I think it's the only time it's ever passed would be in 2011. The State House, to their credit, and it was a strong bipartisan vote, passed it, but the Senate leadership chose not to consider it. Jane Pinsky, who's, by the way, is the director of the Coalition for Lobbying and Government Reform.
I work for John and Chris on this issue. I just want to say, in the current session of the General Assembly, the bill in the House has 61 co-sponsors, plus 13 other people who support it. So if your math is better than mine, we know that's better than half of the North Carolina House supports it. In 2011, it was voted 88-27. We think that if we could get it to the floor of the Senate, we might be able to pass it. And if you're like me, you're thinking 2020 is a long way away, except that the closer we get to 2020, the more partisan it becomes. I'd like to do it for Mr. Kirk before I retire, which is on the horizon. But I'd also like to do it because I think in the long run it creates tremendous interaction of ideas. Representative Charles Jeter from Mecklenburg County is one of our big supporters, said he's fun to get to go and have a candidate, an opponent with him who would argue ideas. And he thinks that he can always win on those, but that it's a good thing for North Carolina if we start having, open discussion. And if people are interested, I have materials about the bill, or you can email John or Chris, and I can get some more information.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.